Yeah, okay. So, Jeff Mann, if you don't know him, he is like, kind of, I would start an ex NSA guy. Jeff is very, very well respected in information security industry. He's a advocate, advisor, hacker, evangelist, mentor, teacher, international keynote speaker, and former host of Security and Compliance Weekly, and co-host on Paul's Security Weekly Tribe of Hackers contributor, including Red Team, Security Leaders, and Blue Team editions, and a member of a cabal of the Kurmagadon. Kormajan. Sorry, my English is my second language. I can use that as an excuse. Um, Jeff currently serves as a PCI QSA and a trusted advisor for online business systems. Also, a grant advisory board member of Gula Tech Foundation, advisory board member for the Technology Advancement Center, and it is the director of diversity, equity, and inclusion for Hack for Kids, non for profit. Over 40 years of experience working in all the aspects of computer network information security, including cryptography, risk management, vulnerability analysis, compliance assessments, forensic analysis, and pen testing. He's a certified National Security Agency Crypt Analyst, designed and fielded the first software-based crypto system ever produced by National Security Agency. Inventor of the Wiz wheel, a cryptographic cipher wheel used by the US Special Forces for over a decade. Currently on display at the National Cryptographic Museum. Honorary lifetime member of the Special Forces Association. Previously held security research, management, and product development roles with the National Security Agency, the Department of Defense, and the private sector enterprises. Pioneering member of the first pen testing Red Team at NSA. For the past 28 years, he has been a pen tester, security architect, consultant, QSA, and a PCI SME, providing the consulting and advisory services to many nation's best known companies. If you want to watch his Dark Net Diaries episode number 83, that would be great. We are trying to get you like for last 5 years. Finally, we are able to make it. So thank you.
Thank you. I should be good. Everybody can hear me okay? Thank you for the introduction. It's great to be here, and I'm going to stall while the sound lady is making some adjustments. Out of curiosity, raise your hand if you're 40 years old or younger. Yeah, so I've been doing this stuff for your entire life and then some. I've been doing PCI for 20 years, which continues to boggle my mind because even PCI is almost a generation old now. You've heard a lot about me in the introduction. Stole my thunder a little bit, but that's okay. I'll go over a little bit about this. I want to start by asking you guys a trivia question. Who knows the importance of this date? Shout it out if you think you know what it is. Anyone? This is part of the problem of everybody being under 40. My references to cultural iconic things are kind of old. Give up? Now raise your hand if you have no idea who or what Skynet is. Be honest. Okay, we're good. Or at least you're not telling the truth. I mean, you heard a lot about me in my introduction. I'll go over some of that in more detail today. My story is really, is it me walking? Is that part of the problem? Or you're just keeping it to adjust? Test one. I'll just keep talking and someday we'll hit it. This is my contact information. I am a consultant by day. I work for a company called OBS Global. We're actually based in Winnipeg, although I'm down in the United States. We have a risk, security, and privacy practice that's pretty much universal. We go anywhere. And I happen to have a couple clients up here in Edmonton, so I've been coming up here for a couple years. So the planets aligned this year, and I'm here speaking, I'm here working, and I'm here and it's not snowing and it's above freezing, which is what I'm most excited about. That's a little bit of a summary of my background in writing. Sort of cut my teeth at NSA. Been out in the private sector for quite a long time. I consider myself an information security professional because I started in the organization called InfoSec at NSA. Oh, that's my compulsory OBS Global slide. I'm getting out of order. I do a podcast called Paul's Security Weekly. Anybody ever watch or listen to Paul's Security Weekly? If not, that's where you find it, securityweekly.com. It's one of the oldest podcasts in the industry. It's been going on almost 20 years. I'm spending 2 days here. At the end of the week, I'm going to go down to Grand Rapids, Michigan. I'm speaking at a conference called GurCon. I'm very excited that Paul, the Paul and Paul Security Weekly, he'll actually be coming there too. And we'll get to hang out together. I've been trying to get him to come to that conference for a long time. This is what I was trying to get to. I'm also a hacker. I identify as a hacker. I didn't grow up thinking that I was a hacker, but over time I figured out, yeah, that's what I am. And during COVID, I had a lot of time to clean my closet. So I got organized and posted that picture. One of our listeners, when I posted this on Twitter, and I refuse to say that other name, it's just Twitter, they helped me out with the organization. As was mentioned, there was a series of books that were published a couple years ago before COVID called Tribe of Hackers. It's a set of books where the editor, Marcus Carey, went around. I don't want to stand there. How's this? This is better. The editor went out and found people that are known in the industry in various aspects of the industry and asked them all the same set of questions. So every chapter in the book is a different person asking the same set of questions, like what's good and bad about the industry? What's your favorite hacker movie? What would you do differently? What were your greatest successes and failures? Different types of things. And I happen to be one of 2 people that was asked to contribute to all 4 books in the series. If you want to find out who the other person is, of course, you have to go out and buy the books. I don't make any money off that. It was also mentioned there's a Darknet Diaries episode. It's actually Marcus Carey, who was the editor of Tribe of Hackers, and myself. We both have an NSA background, but my part's better, of course. And it was also mentioned that I'm a member of something called the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. So very often I'll go around and introduce myself or describe myself as a curmudgeon. A curmudgeon is that sort of proverbial grumpy old man, but this particular group is a bunch of people that hang out, that we're all old timers, people that have been in this industry from the very beginning and actually predate it. And we hang out with a gentleman who's sort of in the pink shirt off on the left there, gentleman named Gene Spafford, or Spaff is what he's known as his friends. He really is truly the pioneer, one of the real pioneers in this industry. He wrote the book on security, published it back in like the late 80s. And back then it was called Unix and Internet Security. I have a picture of it later on we'll get to. Several years ago, I was speaking at a conference and I met a guy at a speaker dinner the night before, and he said, I think it was actually a BSides, come to think of it. I asked him what he was speaking about. He said, I'm going to give a talk on introduction to cryptography. So I'm like, that's cool. I kind of know a little bit about that. So I went to his talk and he gave a very interesting talk about early codes and ciphers and things like that, secret writings. And I thought, gee, I should give a talk like that because I kind of lived it. So I put together a talk, and I was working at the time for a vendor that had a marketing department with a summer intern, and I talked him into giving me a little graphic. So I came up with the idea of Tales from the Crypt Analyst. Most people probably don't even remember there used to be an HBO show called Tales from the Crypt. Before that, like back when I was a kid, there was a comic book called Tales from the Crypt. Anyway, that's the graphic. So the first part of that first talk, I sort of went over the first couple years of my history at NSA. That is my certification as a crypt analyst, over 30 years old. As was mentioned, I was at NSA at a very unique time where the digital age was just sort of becoming a thing. We were doing machine cryptography. We were building little black boxes that did the codes and ciphers, but we weren't really into the digital age yet. We had, my first job was my desk had a standalone IBM PC. That's kind of what was around. And I had a customer approach me that was part of the military machine, and they were people that worked with people that they recruited in certain other parts of the world, and they would want to communicate with secret messages using something called a one-time pad. A one-time pad, as you can see there, is a piece of paper. It's a pad of paper that has random characters written on it, and you write your message one character at a time, and then both sides know how to combine the two letters to get a third letter or character, and that's what becomes the cipher and what is sent. It's actually a perfectly secure system. It's unbreakable because there's only two copies of the key, and as long as the key is not stolen, and as long as the key, as in the name, is only used one time, there is no mathematical cryptographic way of breaking it. So perfect security. We don't use them anymore because they're slow. We've sacrificed security for speed and convenience. This is a keynote, so that's your first life lesson right there. Anyway, this client approached me, and the caseworkers, as they were, the people that were in locked rooms and secure facilities that would spend hours encrypting and decrypting these messages letter by letter, he asked, "There's this PC on the desk. Isn't there any way we could do this on the PC and speed things up?" And I was young and naive and didn't know the politics and the bureaucracy of NSA. I said, "Yeah, that makes sense. Why not?" So I ended up becoming a project manager and figuring out a way to get this paper key, which was printed by NSA. We had a printing office at the time. But to take that same key and put it onto that thing in the middle, it's called a floppy disk. It's not just the save icon. Or that's what the save icon is based on. This was, as it turned out, revolutionary. It had never been done before. I was talking to managers and chief scientists and people like that at NSA. The chief scientist told me, there's really no such thing as software. It's all hardware. That's all we do. I had to go through a design specification review, something called Functional Security Requirements Specification, FSRS. It was all written for hardware, and I had to force fit this software thing through it. One of the requirements, for example, is you have to be able to, when you have a piece of paper and you've used it, it's really easy to destroy it. You burn it, you rip it up into pieces. The people that are in the field, their one-time pad very often was printed on very, very small paper, very small pads that could fit in the heel of your shoe. And they were actually printed on rice paper, so you could eat it to get rid of it, because those people were literally putting their lives on the line. But we had to figure out how to put that on a floppy disk and then securely delete a page at a time of the key. And so I was told, well, you just come up with a secure deletion routine. So I'm like, okay, tell me one. Well, it turns out there wasn't one. Nobody had ever had to do it before. So we had to figure out a way to do it, and do it in a way that was going to eliminate the key from the floppy disk. To the best of my knowledge, that was the first foray into software, at least in terms of a crypto system, that NSA had ever done. I put this pitch before the senior level management of NSA. This is the InfoSec side, sort of the board of directors. And they very begrudgingly said, okay, we'll let you do it, but don't do this again. Somebody was asking me earlier if I get nervous speaking in front of crowds, and the answer is no, because the very first thing I did when I was at NSA was I had to get up in front of all these suits, all these old men with pocket protectors and slide rules and very esteemed, studious group. And I was this young kid saying, yeah, we're going to do something new and different. But I got it done. Also mentioned was the whiz wheel. I was working with another client called the U.S. Special Forces, the Green Berets, They were also using one-time pads. I was actually helping them come up with a new memory crypto system in case they had to drop all their pads and they were on the run, but still wanted to send a secure message. And in doing that, I wanted them to be able to use the algorithm, as it were, which is a 3-letter substitution based on something called a visionaire square, which that's the version of it they got on their one-time pad. That's the front page of every one-time pad they had. I wanted them to be able to use that because the people that would do the encryption and decryption of the messages would memorize these 3-letter combinations. And so it's already in their head. I'm there visiting them, working on different manual schemes, wanting to use that algorithm, struggling with the table, which you can see is pretty awkward. And I thought, I've just been through a introduction to cryptography course. I've learned about cipher wheels, Caesar ciphers, the little orphan Annie decoder ring. So I thought there ought to be a way to do this out of this table. So came up with this idea of making a wheel. Long story short, they loved it. We ended up producing 15,000 of them and distributing them. And as far as I can tell from talking to former Green Berets over the years, they were used at least into the earliest 21st century. They were still being used after 9/11 when we began the invasion of Afghanistan. Anyway, that wheel is now on display at the National Cryptologic Museum, which is the museum associated with the National Security Agency in Fort Meade, Maryland. I happen to be from Maryland. I live in Maryland. This is a picture of the museum. There's a whole display case. It's actually a display of a bunch of different cipher wheels, the oldest one being from the 1830s. And there's mine at the end. The little write-up they did, man reinvents the wheel. When I created the wheel, my boss at the time put in for a cash award for me. He had to do a little write-up abstract, and he titled this little abstract, Man Reinvents Wheel. So it kind of stuck. There's obviously more stories to tell, more tales to tell of those first days. I gave that talk, I don't know how many years ago, but if you go to YouTube, type in my name, type it correctly with one N and Tales from the Crypt, you should be able to find one or more copies of talks that I've given telling all of those stories. But that's not why we're here today. Another date. This is the one that everybody should know. This is your second talking point since this is a keynote. Anybody know what this date is? You should know this date. Take notes on this date. This is what started it all for us. This is why we're all here today. This is when the internet became publicly available with the publication of the first web browser, which was called Mosaic. So take that note down. You don't have to remember the month and day probably. Just remember this all started in 1993. By 1993, I was working still at NSA, still in the InfoSec organization. And I tell this story in the sequel to talk, which is more Tales from the Crypt Analyst. I was working in an organization that was doing fielded systems evaluations. We were testing the security of all of our great crypto systems and code systems and little black boxes that we had designed and built, and they were perfectly secure. And we were sending them out with our troops, our military, our diplomats, State Department, and things like that. But somebody at NSA came up with this brilliant idea that they realized the way that the main part of NSA, the operations side, which is where we do code breaking, which is what we're mostly known for, except for these days, violating human rights, but it's another story. Historically, let's say, we were known as the code breakers. We were the Crypt Analysts, and we were intercepting communications from all over the world in any way, shape, or form, which is part of what gets really classified. But essentially, that was the main mission. And somebody figured out one of the reasons that we're often successful breaking other people's communications is we take advantage of the fact that they don't use them correctly. They don't change passwords. One-time pads, I worked at Ops one time, and we had an adversary that we were evaluating where they were using one-time pad key. They would use a page for a week. When you do that and do multiple messages, you introduce cryptographic vulnerabilities and you can break it. People finding bypasses, shortcuts. A lot of the radio operators that were using this equipment, 18, 19, 20 years old, not to disparage young people, but they would find shortcuts. They would find a way to get the message around. So we thought, or somebody at NSA thought, we ought to turn that around and figure out how that gets done to our systems. Are there ways to bypass our systems? Are there ways to misuse those systems? One of the divisions in that office that I was in was focused on what we called at the time distributed systems. That's what we called the early networks. There were computers that were starting to get plugged into each other with physical wires and plugged into things called routers, which would actually enable communications, the sort of the beginnings of what we now know as the internet. So 1993 was when I was in this office and the internet was becoming more of a thing. There had already been some fairly famous breaches, but it was mostly mainframes at universities because most of the internet was the government and research universities at that point. It wasn't really in the public hands, but as it was becoming more into the public hands, this idea of computer hacking and networking was becoming more of a thing. So there was a small group of us that decided we're going to learn how to do that. We're going to learn how to break into computers and networks. This book was published, I think, in 2015. And in this book, the 4th chapter, which is entitled Eligible Receiver, there's a paragraph, and I always like to do a dramatic reading, but I don't have it memorized. Somewhere in the middle, during its most sensitive drills, the Red Team worked out of a chamber called the Pit, which was so secret that few people at NSA knew it existed. And even they couldn't enter without first passing through 2 combination locked doors. One of the people that I worked with at the time when this book came out, they got a copy, they read it, they got to this chapter and he's sending emails and texting all of the other people from our little group because we happened to work in an office that we had nicknamed the Pit. We were trying to be hackers, live the hacker culture, learn the hacker culture, which is code for just we were being nerds and geeks. And we named our office kind of like, again, an ancient cultural reference, a show called MASH, where the doctors from MASH, they called their tent where they lived the swamp. So we were trying to be geeky and edgy. And somehow, and to this day, I don't really know the actual story of how the fact that this small group of guys that were learning how to do pen testing and learning how to break into networks, and we were nicknaming our office the Pit, somehow that got into the folklore and got into a book. But it means we're famous. There were 6 of us all told. I currently only have permission to acknowledge one other person that was the Pit that's out in the private sector. That's the guy next to me there. Even he's becoming a cultural relic. He was the founder of a small startup company called Tenable Network Security. Anybody hear of Nessus? Yeah, he's the one he didn't write Nessus, but he was responsible for the company that was Nessus. He was actually in the Air Force at the time. He came to the Pit a little after we had started, and we're still friends to this day, and he'll often introduce me as the person that taught him his first pen testing attacks way back in the day. I actually realized I have to update this slide because the 2 people that are still at NSA, I learned a little while ago that one of them's retired. Lucky him. And then there's 2 other people out in the private sector, but they choose to remain anonymous. So I don't tell you who they are. So very quickly, a little bit of story about the Pit. It was something that was completely new. It was something that was completely popular. And I mentioned the books, Spaff, The Cabal, The Curmudgeons. That's his book on the left there, Practical Unix in Internet Security. Book on the right, written by a gentleman named Cheswick and Bellevin. I should give the other guy, Simon Garfunkel. I've met him virtually, never met him in person. Firewalls and internet security is sort of the story of 2 guys that, similar to a person on the next slide, working at universities, because that's where the internet was with mainframes, discovered some hacking activity and tried to figure out who they were and tried to track them down and catch them. The most famous one being Cliff Stahl, who wrote The Cuckoo's Egg. He was worked at a university. Back in those days, you had to pay for your time on the mainframe, and he was going over the monthly bill and noticed something like a 70-cent $1.50 discrepancy in the bill. And in investigating that, that led to ultimately him discovering that there were East German hackers, this is back in the days of the Soviet Union and the Cold War, that had broken into this university mainframe and was stealing government research, because that university happened to be doing classified research for, you know, places like maybe that I used to work for. There's a gentleman, I put this slide up a little while ago because I spoke at a conference. That's a gentleman named Win Schwartau. He's been writing about the coming information warfare for probably about 35 years. He was speaking right after me at a conference. So I put it up there and I said that was early FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Because we were new at this, because the whole thing was new, and we were initially doing it just for the classified systems within the DoD, but somehow word got out on the street that we had this capability. Word got out, and we were approached at some point by the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice wanted us to do penetration tests, try to break into their internet-facing systems. This is kind of an important story for me because it did shape sort of my career path, as it were. We were contacted by the DOJ, and I was working at the time. I was sort of the business leader of the pit because I actually had a business degree from college, and I was working with the lawyers trying to figure out how to make this all legal, how to streamline the process, how to have a process. And at the time, it was known that NSA was only supposed to do work on classified systems. The DOJ systems were unclassified. That was the purview of another organization called NIST, the National Institutes of Standards and Technology. At the time, though, they were known for not having any technical capability in the area of internet and network security, so that it was often deferred over to us in a sort of a backroom arrangement of some sort. But we were trying to do the right thing. So the lawyers said, well, you need to have the cabinet level positions ask for a favor, basically. So the Attorney General at the time, Janet Reno, she had written a letter to the Department of Defense asking for this service. This is the letter going back from the director of NSA at the time, General Minahan, saying, yeah, we're happy to do this. This is a project that we'll take on. This was after several months. I mean, this letter is dated August 21st. I think they approached us in like March or April of that year. It took months to work through all the bureaucracy and the politics. You'll notice my name is up there as the point of contact, but also that date is very important because this happened on August 17th, the weekend before the letter was to be delivered. It had already been signed, but it just had not been delivered to the client yet. The very first government hack, government website defacement happened to the Department of Justice. I get into the office on Monday morning, get a call from the client, the Department of Justice person, and he said, help. We've been hacked. We've been breached. It had never happened before. We need help. So I set out to figure out a way to get through all the bureaucracy and get down to Washington, D.C., to DOJ headquarters. So I hung up the phone with them, picked up the phone with the lawyers and explained to them what happened and said, what do we need to do to get down there tomorrow, to get a team down there? There wasn't really forensics back then either. There wasn't anything written down. There were no training courses or anything like that. So we did go down. I jumped through the hoops that I needed to, got down there on a Tuesday. By Thursday, I got a call from somebody back at the pit saying, I'm just going to quote it, so I apologize. Jeff, the shit's hit the fan. You guys got to drop what you're doing and come back now. So apparently somebody whistle blew on us and somebody had gotten wind that NSA I have a lot longer than that. I've got like an hour and 15 minutes just to keep it in mind, which is dangerous because I'll just tell more stories. We're where was I? Oh, got to go back. We'll go back. I get yelled at. I was put on double secret probation. I learned years later that they were not only trying to get me fired, they were trying to come up with information to prosecute me, because of something that I learned about that I never knew before was something called the NSA Charter, which was based on something called the Church Proceedings. The Church Proceedings was a government subcommittee that was formed after the Watergate incident, which was back in the early 70s. This is ancient history now. But the result of this study that happened after the Watergate break-in during the presidential campaign of 72 was, it's like 2 volumes, but basically it said NSA, CIA, FBI have a lot of power and a lot of capability, but really no legislative oversight, no rules, no boundaries. And so the result of these church proceedings was to give boundaries to each of these agencies. NSA had the NSA Charter, which I knew about it, and it basically says that NSA can't do what NSA does to US citizens. So when you're doing the ethical white hat, good guy, whatever we call it these days, red teaming exercise, technically NSA couldn't do that. So that's where we got in trouble. That's where I got in trouble. This is very rare. We weren't allowed to have cameras in our offices. We weren't allowed to have recording devices. We weren't allowed to have transmitters. And I honestly don't remember how we got a camera in our office, but this is actually a picture of my cubicle in the pit. And my friends, the other members of the pit, had found police tapes and decided to quarantine my desk area. Little did NSA know that you shouldn't let a hacker have access to his workstations, even though they'd locked his account. But that's another story for another day. But interestingly enough, when I was putting together this talk this year, I realized, geez, that happened at the end of August, and I left NSA by the end of September. That really did alter my life, and it got me out the door and into the private sector, which is where I am now. More of that story, the way that we developed the pit, the way that we developed our methodologies for doing pen testing, ethical hacking, vulnerability assessments, and so on and so forth, chronicled in more Tales from the Crypt, which you can find out on YouTube as well. Which finally gets us down to, and this cartoon was given to me by a girlfriend back in college, and I think it sums it up very nicely. I'll let you read that a minute. But it brings us back to, or down to, this talk today. This is the 3rd installment in my life story. It started out at the beginning of the year. I thought PCI version 4.0 is coming out. I should give a talk on PCI. And then I thought, nobody wants to hear a talk on PCI. But I thought it might be interesting to talk about how I got from NSA pen tester cryptographer to PCI QSA, which is sort of the tale that I tell today is what happened from late 1996 up until 2004. So in terms of the history books, that's the time frame. I had already been, as many of us were, talking to a bunch of different companies, thinking about going out into the private sector because it paid better. We had these illusions of becoming rich and famous because we could solve the security problem by breaking in and telling people what the holes are. They'd close them and fix them. Everything would be good. Yes, we were young and naive. I went back when I was under double secret probation, started talking to all these different companies, one bit. So I went to work for a company that doesn't exist anymore called Computer Sciences Corporation. I was only there for 6 months because right after I started, the gentleman that hired me left to go out and start their own practice at another company. So I was just kind of stuck there as a government contractor. Nobody knew what to do with me. Hacking lore. I used to work in the same office where another hacker named Johnny Long works. So I met Johnny Long in the late 1900s. He wrote a book on, was it Google hacking? Is that what he wrote? He's written several books. So I ended up working for another government contractor. I went looking very quickly, and I landed at a company called Nichols Research. They were another government contractor, but they were interested in setting up a commercial professional services practice, doing the pen testing, vulnerability assessment type stuff, but focusing on the private sector. It's hard to put this in context. This is late 90s. I mean, the industry of red teaming and pen testing and all that really boiled down to, back in those days, try to break into the company's network because they were just plugging into the internet as a backbone. And about the only security tool or protection there was out there was a firewall. And there was only really like 2 or 3 firewalls on the market. And, you know, if you went to a big trade conference back then, there'd be like 3 vendors sitting at a table. You had 3 choices of firewalls. There was a vulnerability scanning company or two in the very beginnings of what was called intrusion detection. But we wanted to do the consulting and advisory work because we were knowledgeable, and we believed that the way that you explain security to people is not by just, or solve the security problem is not by throwing a bunch of technology. You got to understand that it's a problem, it's a process, it's something you do. SANS was in its very early stages of existence. I think they got started in the mid-90s. They used to put out these posters where this is everything that had to do with security all in one page, you know, 2 feet by 3, I'm sorry, 2/3 of a meter by a meter. I'm sorry, I'm from America. I try to translate. All the companies that did all the different things, they would be on the back page, and our group was actually listed as one of the penetration testing services. But look who else it was mostly back then. It was accounting firms. It was firms that were accustomed to already having very deep connections into companies. And why not pick up one more revenue stream? Yes, I do have something against the big accounting firms and big IT firms, because we were competing against them, and we actually knew what we were doing, and we were pen testers. And I'll probably offend some people, but you know, I learned from doing it. I didn't learn from a book. I didn't learn from taking a class, and I don't have an accounting background, although I do have a business background. More lately, I've realized that accountants are good for things. Another story for another day. But this was essentially the methodology, and we called it pen testing, but it was really a vulnerability assessment, because we would ask our prospective customers, do you want us to just break in and see if we could break in, or do you want us to find all the holes and all the ways that we could break in? And they invariably wanted the latter. So it was invariably what we called a vulnerability assessment. But the fun thing was actually penetration testing. Penetration testing, by the way, the methodology that we've primarily followed, and what most companies that do it to this day follow, is a methodology that was presented in a movie called Sneakers. Anybody old enough to remember the movie Sneakers? If you're young, add this to your watch list. I think it's on one of the streaming channels. I watched it not too long ago. There is, of course, a famous quote in this movie where the quote-unquote bad guy, Ben Kingsley, is talking to Robert Redford, and he's saying, and I always have to refer back because I can't remember anything these days. He says, there's a war out there, old friend, a world war, and it's not about who's got the most bullets. It's about who controls the information. What we see and hear, how we work, what we think. It's all about the information. Keynote, life lesson number 3. It's all about the information. If you don't know that already, learn that. So pretty basic. And again, this was companies that primarily already had local area networks, but they were starting to plug into the internet as a backbone. And it was based on military tactics in some sense, recon, figure out what's out there, plan your attack, learn what the possible holes are, and then go break in and try to get as far as you can and recover and get to as many places. Not a lot of different from what's out there today, but we didn't have all sorts of training courses and degrees and certificates. We were kind of figuring it out as we went along. I mentioned there was a few products out there, one of which was ISS. They were sort of one of the early big vulnerability scanners, and they were all in it for the money, very expensive. And the idea was to buy all their solutions and you'd be secure. They were eventually acquired by IBM. I think the IBM was the X-Force is still the remnants. I don't know if there's anybody there from the old ISS days at this point. They were also very much into real cool marketing. Real Secure was their early attempt at intrusion detection. And they put out this graphic novel. Again, this is probably 97, 98. That's actually the good guy, by the way. The bad guy, the hacker in it, is a scantily clad woman. And I apologize, but this was marketed back in the late 90s. But they had a little bit of a sense of humor. Again, if you remember comic books, they had the old Charles Atlas type of ad at the back page of the thing. It got pulled very quickly. We needed to use a vulnerability scanner right around the same time, like within a week of when I went to work for Nichols. I got a message that this guy up in Calgary had started this company called Secure Networks and put out another scanner called Ballista. And I thought, great, an alternative. I'll use Ballista. So I corresponded with Alfred over email, became one of his early subscribers to his product, and we used it for quite a while. And I've been coming to Calgary for the last couple of years, and it only occurred to me this past year, Alfred's in Calgary. I need to try to visit him. Hasn't happened yet, but it will, hopefully. His company, Secure Networks Incorporated, they mostly just did this vulnerability scanner, and that's not even what they called it back then. Notice it was back in the days of Windows NT. That's how far back we're going. This is a description of Ballista. I liked it mostly because it was an alternative to what everybody else was using. So we could it was a discriminate. There was a guy that worked for the company, put out the definitive paper again back in the late 90s on how to evade intrusion detection, which, to paraphrase, it's probably a 50 or 60 page article. I still have a hard copy of it. Go slow. Again, going back to the movie Sneakers, there's a scene where they have to break in and steal something where there's a thermostat that's detecting an alert on the heat of the room. So if a body walks in, it's going to raise the temperature and trip it. So they hack in and they raise the temperature, and there's a motion detection system in place, but they realize, well, if you move it like 2 inches a second or whatever, you can basically fly under the radar. So there's a scene where Robert Redford's going very slowly and probably takes him an hour to go 10 feet. It's a little Hollywood, but you get the idea. Good things that came out of Secure Networks. What was very common in those days for security startup companies is if they had a product, they had something cool, they got acquired by one of the big IT groups or one of the big companies that was trying to become a security company. So they lasted about a year, very common. And they were not alone. Other companies that got snatched up by network associates, McAfee, antivirus, PGP, which was an encryption tool. Network sniffing used to be done with hardware. There was a network sniffing company that got bought up, and then some other McAfee product. Again, 90s marketing, which I apologize, this is history. We were angry at the time, though, not that there was a scantily clad woman portraying a hacker. She was hacking with Windows 95. Some of the more respectable, famous companies where people from the DoD and NSA went to work. TIS, Trusted Information Systems, they produced one of the first firewalls, commercially available firewalls. Wheel Group was, the guys that started the Wheel Group were based primarily in Texas, and they were working for the Air Force, where there was the first security operations center set up. So they came out into the private sector, and they had basically early intrusion detection response tools. All these companies got snatched up very quickly. Wheel Group was acquired by Cisco. Cisco's been trying to be a security company for over 30 years. The guy that's sometimes credited for being the inventor of the firewall, although he will disavow it, he doesn't want to take the credit, Marcus Raynham, but he wrote code that was in a lot of the commercial firewalls for decades. He worked for Trusted Information Systems. They had a consulting practice. I had interviewed with them. When they got acquired, they got rid of the consulting practice. So one of the members of our team, if you see there, it says Trusted Information Systems. That was the person that used to run their consulting practice. And then, of course, myself from the National Security Agency. We had somebody from the Securities Exchange Commission, the White House, and so on and so forth. So we had a pretty experienced team, but we were small. Nobody knew who we were. We used different tools. Back then, it was very common to connect to the internet over modem. on a dial-up. And so there was this thing called war dialing where you'd call phone numbers and see if a computer answered, a la the movie War Games back in 1983. There was publicly available programs, but this particular package was put together by one of my mentors, a woman named Becky Bass. She was another one of the true pioneers. She was one of the founding members of the Cabal of the Curmudgeons. I was inducted into the Cabal in 2017, and she died, and she was one of my sponsors to get into that Cabal, and she passed away a few months after that. If you don't know anything about her, she wrote some of the early books on intrusion detection. She was literally talking to the management at NSA when we had the pit thing going on. She was talking to all the old managers, all the old white guys, saying, you don't understand what they're doing, but they need to do it. It's important. You need to back them up and leave them alone. So she was very much instrumental in my career as well. So I just like to give her a moment. Some of our companies that were our clients, obviously we still had some ties to the government. One story I'll tell, I wish I could find a slide for this, but I can't. We were doing a pen test of a government facility, major secure, I forget what MSRC stands for, but basically they had all the 4 or 5 different mainframes, the best, fastest, strongest, most powerful computers of the day. And it was at a research facility where they were trying to do fabulous new things with the technology, like learning how to stream video and learning how to do holographic images and all sorts of stuff that we take for granted today. They hired us to do a pen test. They were run by the Army. They are located at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is in Ohio, which is Air Force. We had gone through all the rigmarole of getting permissions and getting our get out of jail free card and deciding what times we were going to be there and what was our windows of opportunity. Somebody forgot to tell the Air Force, which was the tenant, we were really on their network or trying to break into their network. So woke up one morning and there was an Air Force CERT advisory, Computer Emergency Response Team advisory issued against us. So I've actually had a CERT advisory issued against me. Because it was Air Force, it's classified. So if you go to the Wayback Machine, I can find the page where it was listed, but they didn't capture the other part. So someday I hope to find it. We were working very closely with another Maryland-based company called Jex. They were one of the first hosting providers. You could arguably say they were one of the cloud providers, because guess what? Cloud is just hosting. So we were their partner. We had co-branded marketing literature. Quick story. This guy, Amit Yoran, he's currently the CEO of Tenable. He ran this company called Riptech. And Riptech was a company that we were working with because we were doing the architecture work, we were doing the pen testing, all the fun stuff. We didn't want to do the firewall installation, so we farmed that off to this third-party company called Riptech. When shortly after he became CEO, he replaced Ron Gula. I met him, and I was saying, we have this common background because I used to work at Nichols, and we used to give you a bunch of work. And he said, oh my gosh, you're kind of responsible for my success, because at the time, he wasn't sure he wanted to get into cybersecurity. He wasn't sure if it was a thing that he wanted to do, but we were giving him so much business, he thought, heck, I'm going to stick with it. And so there he is. So Ron has me to thank for his career, and Amit has me to thank for his career. You're welcome, guys. Of course, Digex, like everybody else, they got acquired, so they became Intermedia Communications, but they brought us with them. The guy that owned Digex, he took the proceeds, a guy named Chris McCleary, and started this other company called US Internetworking, which really was truly one of the first cloud providers. Their idea at the time was they would host all the expensive programs and lease them out to customers, but they'd be responsible for the administration and the maintenance. This is back in the server client type of days. Again, we became their partner. But they also hired us one time to do a pen test. Just to confirm, I really do have till 10:30, right? Okay. And I have a clock there, which is brilliant. I actually, during my cleanup, I found the actual 2 or 3 page pen test report write-ups. This is the actual pen test report write-up. The guy that was their security manager, he got fed up with talking to management about, you're not giving us enough money and resources to do the things we need to do. He got in touch with me and said, okay, you got a weekend, I think it's in there somewhere, 48 hours. Do as much as you can, do as much damage as you can. So we broke in. We found out that their single point of protection, a firewall, which was mostly what we had back then, didn't do much to stop us. How did we get in? We found a misconfigured SQL server. So how did we break in? SQL injection. That's what we did. We didn't call it that back then. We just knew that we could add stuff to the end of streams that we would send to a particular port to a SQL server. We were able to get to everything. We got in, we immediately set up a base camp and set up a secure shell tunnel out. And they had intrusion detection systems in place, but we were going over authorized ports, and we were initiating, once we got in, our activity from the inside out, which was implicitly trusted in those days. So we got Unix passwords and cracked them. We even got Windows NT passwords and cracked them. Ron Gula, the guy I used to work with in the pit, he was actually working at USI at the time. He was so fed up with what we were able to do and the inefficiencies of the prevailing intrusion detection tool that they had at the time, he decided to start his own company and write his own software. So his first foray into cybersecurity was an intrusion detection product called Dragon, and his company he called Network Security Wizards. And, that lasted 15 months before he got acquired, and that's gave him the proceeds to go ahead and start Tenable ultimately. So Ron has me to thank for his career twice, by the way. One of the guys that was our customers at Digex got involved with some people from a company called Metagroup, which was kind of like a Gartner type group at the time. They wanted to start up a company, so they, that was security focused as a spinoff. So they talked us basically our whole practice into going to this startup called Meta Security Group. It was the .com craze, so it doesn't really have a happy ending. We had kind of an identity crisis. We were Meta Security Group, then we were Meta Secure Ecom Solutions. But this happened during that time. I don't know how much of an impact that this had in Canada. I imagine that you have some sense of understanding of it. It was an amazing time from a cybersecurity consulting perspective, because we'd been going around for years telling companies that all sorts of bad things could happen because of all the things that we were seeing in terms of vulnerabilities and weaknesses in their network. And all of a sudden they were paying attention, and they were very focused, and they were listening. And it lasted for at least 9 months. It was amazing. Some of the good things that came out of Meta Security Group, there's a guy, probably most of you don't know him, but he started a company called InGuardians. It's one of the better high-end pen testing companies, at least in the United States. The guys that were on my team, they went to work for another company, and they've been responsible for the Crack Me If You Can contest at DEF CON for like the last 20 years or something like that. One of the people from Meta Security Group's on the board at Black Hat. So we had people that did stuff and continue to do stuff. But I was frustrated because after going around and talking to companies for several years and trying to explain to them why they needed to do security and why they needed to set up a policy and have a plan, and all they wanted to do was, well, just tell us what we need to buy. Tell us how many firewalls and where to put them, and what blinky box needs to go where, and what color should the light be. And we'd pen test them every 6 months, and the same way we got in the previous 6 months was the same way we got in again. Same passwords were being cracked, and so on and so forth. It was a combination of that, and the guys that I was working with were younger and much more into the technology, and they were more into the automation and writing scripts on the fly. But I was like, there's got to be a better way to get through to people and get them to understand this, because it's not enough apparently to stick their nose in it once you've broken in. and said you've got root access to everything and own everything. And about that time, I decided to go to work for a company that was called Trustwave. And shortly after I went to work there, it was acquired by a company called Amberon. But they did this thing called PCI, Payment Card Industry. It was late 2004, and I was handed the version 1.0 of the Payment Cards Industry Data Security Standard. And I was told, here, read this. This is what we're going to do. And I read it and I thought, this is actually pretty decent. This is a pretty good, high-level, comprehensive summary of everything you need to do to protect your organization, both from a technical level and from a policy level. And I would say that to this day, that it's still a pretty decent overview. And it's 20 years old. There aren't a lot of things that are this detailed, and we can argue whether it's detailed or high level, that have been around and made as much impact as PCI has for the last 20 years. I'm not here to pitch PCI, but that's just how I feel about it. I try to recommend to every client that I have, pay attention to this. Don't just do all the paperwork part of it because it's necessary. Do all the paperwork part of it as a guide, and especially all the documented procedures. Write it so the next person can do it. The policy is what drives everything. You've got to have the stuff written down so you know what to do with all that technology that you necessarily need to purchase these days. I don't like the technology, but I concede that we're kind of stuck with it. These are some of the clients I've had over the years, and those are some pretty, major brands. I've had clients in Canada for several years. What I liked about PCI most, though, was while the clients that I was working with didn't have any better understanding or necessarily any better interest in security, they at least knew they had to do it. So they were sort of a captive audience and would listen. But my goal was always to, no, I don't want you to just go through this just to go through it. I want you to go through it and understand why it makes sense to do all these different things, because all the different requirements in PCI grew out of breaches and grew out of attacks that had happened to other companies. It's a hierarchy of response to bad things that have happened. I'm allowed to say that I worked for these companies. TJX companies, they were famously breached back in the late 2000s, 2007, 2008. I was their QSA for 6 years. Same hacker group also knocked over Heartland Payment Systems. They were a payment processor, They're supposed to know better, but they didn't. And I'm allowed to say I worked for them because that was publicly available, because Visa and MasterCard list all the PCI compliant service providers. The New York Times, when I went to work for them, they actually owned another newspaper called the Boston Globe. New York and Boston in the U.S., they have sort of a big sports rivalry. So it was kind of a secret that they owned the Boston Globe. They didn't like to advertise that. But the Boston Globe owned a regional newspaper that was out in the western part of the state of Massachusetts. And somebody there at this small town newspaper had tried to print something off their subscriber database, didn't know what they were doing, and ended up dumping their entire subscriber database and printing it out on that old IBM paper that was kind of green and white lines that had the dots, the holes on either side, and just spew out. So they had this big, huge stack of paper, and they thought, well, this is a waste. So they put it in the recycle bin. And somebody saw this big stack of paper in the recycle bin and thought, well, that's a waste. So they pulled it out and they used it to wrap up the bundles of newspapers that, the 50 at a time, 25 at a time, that they were then sending it out throughout the state, until one convenience store said, hey, I was looking at the paper you wrapped the newspapers in, and I'm seeing like bank account numbers and credit card numbers. So New York Times had this incident. PCI 4.0 is here now. You should know that by now. So in the last few minutes, I'll get to the keynote portion and vent a little bit for you guys. And I'm going to say what I'm going to say. I'm not going to say much. I'm going to let you read it. This slide deck that I'm going to show you now is from, I think, 1998. I'm not changing it. The words are what we said 26 years ago. This is why you need to have security. This is why you need to have a program in place. Don't worry about taking pictures of this, by the way. I'll have a QR code at the end if you want to just get a copy of this slide deck. A lot of people like these slides and like to take them back and show it to their managers. What makes a network insecure? It's not the lack of technology. It's the lack of really knowing what you're trying to accomplish with security, based on not having it written down, not having it sort of charted out. This is what we said that you needed to do. We were teaching that security is an ongoing process. It's a verb. It's something you do. It's not a state that you achieve. I work with clients that want to get to the finish line and be PCI compliant. And I've been trying to explain for them for 20 years that you're not done there. And the PCI program has been trying to say for 20 years, no, there's things that you're supposed to be doing throughout the day, throughout the year, daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and so on and so forth. 20 years in, a lot of people still don't get it. But this is what we were teaching way back then. And I believe this less and less today, but I still think it's true. I think maybe someday technology will solve everything. I think technology, that's what we want. We want just everything to be secure and not have to think about it. Maybe we'll get there someday, but I don't think we're there yet. Until then, we need to have policies around all the things that we talk about that can go wrong. The people being the weakest link. You hear that one a lot. I happen to think that process is the weakest link, because lack of process, lack of procedure, lack of consistent ways of doing things is what ultimately causes just about every breach that you've heard about. I mean, pick a breach, we could sit down and talk about it. I'll tell you it was a process failure, ultimately. What's an information security policy? It's your plan. It's your strategy. It's what do we have that's worth stealing? What do we have that's worth protecting? What do we have that's worth putting money up against? What it's not. I feel like these slides should be reversed, because to this day, this is what most people think policy is. Oh, we got to go through the documents. We got to have it all written down. I have to rewrite all the statements out of the PCI standard and change shall to must, and then we're done. I'm not giving you enough time to read it. I apologize, but you get the point. This is not a new message, and we're still working on the same message 20 years into it, 30 years into it, 40 years into it. And again, you can have these access to these slides later. This is changing, but I still think senior management, they don't really get it. They don't fundamentally understand security, and they don't necessarily need to, but they need to trust the people that they've hired to think about and to worry about security. How many people have failed a phishing test at their company? Oh, come on, be honest. Every hand should be up. I don't believe any one of you. Did you get fired for it? Did you get fined? Did you get reprimanded? Or did you have to take some stupid 10-minute video, the remedial training, and magically you're more aware? What makes it work? You got to believe in what you're writing down. It's not just words on paper. You got to have consequences. Hopefully it's positive love and attention to the people that are the offenders in the organization. But remember, it's something that's ongoing. When we first pitched this back in 1997, 1998, we talked about the security lifecycle process being 12 to 18 months. I would argue these days the process is the same, but sometimes it's 12 to 18 weeks. Sometimes it's 12 to 18 days. I mean, we're living in a much faster world these days. And I'll say we were wrong. A lot of what the premise for security was back in those days, not we specifically, but we as an industry, we built security based on this belief that we would establish a secure perimeter, that what we had to protect our networks against was the internet, which was displayed on our Visio diagrams as a cloud because it was an unknown. Now's where's all of our resources these days? It's in the cloud. So the ideas of security, which is based on military tactics that go back thousands of years, putting your most sensitive assets in the innermost part. It's where you get ideas of defense in depth and so on and so forth. It worked up to a point, but it doesn't exactly scale for what we're dealing with these days. I'll let you read some of these slides. This is from Meta Security Group, so these slides are probably from 2002 or 2003. There might be a date on. Somehow I flipped that logo. I'm not good at technology. Now the technology's changed a little bit. Like, we don't talk about clicking on attachments in email. Now it's about clicking on the link, but it's the same concept. Patching, that's not a problem anymore, is it? We've solved that problem. Backups, that used to be how we protected against the malware attacks, but now even our backups are being protected. I can't tell you how many times I checked with organizations, because backup is a PCI requirement, and then we'd say, do you ever test your backups? Huh? Have you ever tried to recover your data? Say what? And when they would do it, 90%, the backup didn't work. But, they were checking a box. They had backups. Using a modem while connected, replace that with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is everywhere. 7 mistakes that senior executives make. I'd like to think some of this is changing, but they're not paid to focus on information security or cybersecurity. These are just the ones that I'm highlighting. You can agree or disagree. Replace the firewall with, fill in the blank. But most people believe, especially in executive positions, that security is something you drop in place and you're done and you don't have to think about it. I think most people think that. I think that's the goal, is let's make everything secure so we don't have to think. And I guess my message as a keynote, fourth point, is now we have to think. And as long as we still have to think, we have to do all that other stuff, but the thinking is the key. Well, we've never been hacked before. We haven't had a problem yet. Still hear that to this day. And then the IT groups, the admin groups. Let's just cut to the chase. I mean, you can argue with me, but I don't think I'm wrong. Updated slides for the day. Over the weekend, since I was here, I did some sightseeing and I went to this Indigenous Peoples experience at Fort Edmonton. My client was very gracious enough to take me on a little field trip on Saturday. I highly recommend going if you haven't been there. Very fascinating history. I grew up in the United States. We have our own issues with minorities, but this is what Canada is doing is very amazing. But I learned something, and I think this is how I would like to redefine curmudgeon, is basically what I'm getting at. And I apologize if it's hard to read. There's very variable lighting in the place, and I was trying to take pictures of a lot of words. But again, these slides, I'll have to update the deck on the website. But I want to be known as an elder, I think. I call myself a curmudgeon. What does a curmudgeon mean? I'm an elder. I've lived the life. I've learned the lessons. I've danced the dance. And hopefully at this point in my life, I'm teaching and can pass on some knowledge to the next generation that's rising up. So as an encouragement to you, you should all be aspiring curmudgeons. Anyway. That's the QR code, although I apologize, that last slide won't be on it. But if you want to get a copy of this deck, that's the easiest way to do it. This slide deck is way too big to email. Everybody got it that wants it? Another possibility, if you want to hear more about my origin story and can't find those Tales from Crypt Analyst talks, there's a podcast called The Team House. And if you just type into YouTube Team House and NSA, they interviewed me back in April. They let me talk for 3 hours. Also, find me later out through the day. I do have a limited supply of stickers, not just from this talk, but from all 3 of my talks. So if you're a sticker collector and if you're a hacker, you have to like stickers. That's one of the primary requisites. hit me up, and I'll as long as they last, I'll give you some stickers. And I think there's 5 minutes left. I'd be happy to answer questions. I'll be happy to hear questions. I'm not sure I'll answer them, but anybody have a question?
Okay, here. Oh, there we go. Without a compliance driver, it's very difficult to get companies to buy into making changes to their security for the better. What would be your recommendation for that if there's no compliance requirement?
I don't know any other. The question is, without compliance and regulatory requirements, a lot of companies don't do the stuff they're supposed to be doing. I agree with you. True. That was a true or false question.
I'd recommend a large stick.
What I recommend, compliance and regulatory standard. I've not seen anything else that works at scale. There aren't enough companies out there that are just going to do the right thing, because they're profit-driven companies and they've got a financial statement, and if they don't have to do it, they're not going to do it. Largely, with some exceptions. Next.
So you mentioned about that there was a kind of a encryption strategy with a disk.
Yep.
Right. Back in time in 1993, I guess I was working on one of the companies. They were making a database for another company.
Mm-hmm.
They were making a software basically, and they approached me to, is there a way to make sure that nobody uses my code? So I came out with a plan to cut a CD, a disk at that time, 5.5, I think.
5 1/4?
Yeah.
Yep. Inches, sorry. That's what they're called.
Cut it, and I actually cut with a blade and make a disk copy of it, write some code, then I have a code, match it. That way we used to work at that time to make sure nobody uses it. So I'm just sharing.
I probably would have broken it, but just say. Any other questions? Question here. And if you have to leave, that's fine. You can clap on your way out or something.
Hi, I'm currently a student actually enrolled in the cybersecurity program, and I was wondering if you have any advice to give people who are just entering into the workforce today even.
Try everything. Expose yourself to as many facets of this vast career that you can look at. Don't think, oh, I want to be this, and just go for that. Expose yourself to everything. Try to find something you like doing. Try to find something that you feel like you have the aptitude or the potential to get better at. If you're really lucky, they'll be the same thing. And then do that. You're welcome.
I just want to address the unicorn in the room. This is Rainbow. This is the best $25 that my wife ever spent at clearance at a Target in Salt Lake City. We took Rainbow to the last DerbyCon, and trying to get a 6.5 foot tall unicorn through a revolving door at a hotel is fun. I was telling this story about Rainbow showing up at DerbyCon to Jeff at DEF CON, and he said, I'm pulling my speaker rank and putting a speaker requirement that I have Rainbow on stage with me for my talk. So in cleaning out a closet, we actually discovered we have a backup Rainbow, and apparently I have like a whole army here. So that's why. So
I want my hacker handle to be dances with unicorns.
Yeah.
Any other questions? I want to thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Jeff.
Enjoy.